All right, let's jump right in, shall we? We've got a mountain of articles and guides here all about FCA compliance.
A mountain, huh?
Well, maybe not a mountain, but definitely a lot to cover.
Yeah, it's a pretty dense topic.
But that's what we're here for, right? To break it down, make it digestible, and help everyone, from the seasoned finance pros to those just starting out in the UK, really understand the essentials of navigating the FCA.
Absolutely. And what I find fascinating is that it's not just about rules and regulations.
It's more than just a checklist.
Right. It's about shaping a responsible financial culture
Interesting.
where the consumer is at the forefront.
Okay, I like that.
So let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Let's demystify the FCA, shall we? What is it exactly?
Yeah, what is it and why should anyone care?
And maybe even more importantly, what happens if you don't follow the rules?
Because we all know there are consequences.
Right, some pretty serious ones.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly is this FCA?
Well, the Financial Conduct Authority, or FCA as most people call it, is essentially the watchdog of the UK financial industry.
The watchdog, huh? Keeping everyone in line.
Exactly.
They sound powerful.
They are. They're an independent body.
Independent, so they're not swayed by any particular interest.
Exactly. That's key.
Interesting.
And their job is to make sure the financial markets are playing fair.
Fair, meaning transparent and all of that,
Precisely, fair, transparent, and working properly.
so that everyone has a level playing field.
Yes, and a huge part of their mission is protecting consumers.
Consumer protection is a big deal.
Absolutely. It's front and center in everything they do.
So they're making sure the financial world is safe for consumers.
You got it.
Now let's talk about those consequences we mentioned.
Okay, what happens if you don't play by the FCA's rules?
Because we know they don't just let things slide.
Not at all.
There are some serious repercussions.
For sure. Think hefty fines.
Fines, that's the big one, right?
Yeah, they can be massive, enough to seriously hurt a firm's bottom line.
Ouch, that's gotta sting.
It does.
And then there's the damage to your reputation.
Right, and in the financial world, reputation is everything.
You lose trust, you lose clients, it's a slippery slope.
It really is. So understanding and adhering to FCA regulations is not something you want to take lightly.
So it's not just about avoiding penalties, it's about doing business the right way.
Absolutely. It's about building a sustainable and ethical business.
Okay, so we've established that FCA compliance is crucial.
It's non-negotiable.
But what does it actually look like in practice?
Right. What are the building blocks of this FCA compliance framework? What are the key things firms need to focus on?
Break it down for us.
It's actually a pretty comprehensive system.
Comprehensive meaning it covers everything.
Pretty much from the very top of the organization with things like governance and oversight.
That's the leadership part, right?
Exactly. Making sure the right people are in charge.
And they're accountable. And then it goes all the way down to the nitty-gritty details of training your staff.
Right. Making sure everyone understands the rules and procedures.
So it's like a big interconnected system.
Think of it as building blocks.
Okay, I like that analogy.
You need all the pieces in place for the structure to be strong.
So let's talk about those building blocks.
Okay, where do you want to start?
Let's start at the top with governance and oversight.
All right, good place to begin.
What does that mean in the context of FCA compliance?
It means having strong leadership and clear accountability at the very top of the organization.
So the people at the top need to be setting the tone.
Absolutely, leading by example.
And one of our sources mentions this thing called the SMCR, the Senior Managers and Certification Regime.
Ah, yes, the SMCR, that's a big one.
I'm seeing here that it assigns specific responsibilities to senior managers.
Right, it's not just a vague notion of responsibility anymore.
It's spelled out very clearly who's in charge of what.
Precisely, and there's a requirement for annual certifications.
So they have to prove they're actually doing their job.
Basically, yes.
Interesting. So it's really holding individuals accountable.
Absolutely, that's the whole point of the SMCR.
It's not just about having policies on paper.
Right, it's about making sure the right people are in place and they're truly responsible for what happens.
So the buck stops with them.
It does, and that's a big shift in the compliance landscape.
And I imagine it creates a lot more pressure at the top.
You bet it does.
But it also makes sense.
Right, if you want to create a culture of compliance.
You need to start at the top.
Absolutely, it all flows from there.
Okay, so we've got strong leadership in place.
That's our foundation.
Now, what about risk management? I imagine that's a huge piece of the compliance puzzle in financial services.
You're absolutely right. Risk management is essential.
Because let's face it, financial services are inherently risky, right?
They are. There's always an element of risk involved.
So how does the FCA approach this?
Yeah.
What do they expect from firms?
Well, the FCA expects firms to have really solid systems in place.
Systems for what
It's
exactly?
identifying those risks.
Figuring out what could go wrong.
Right, assessing how serious those risks are.
So you know what to prioritize.
Exactly, and most importantly, mitigating those risks.
Taking steps to minimize the chances of something bad happening.
You got it.
And it could involve a whole range of things.
It does. It could mean implementing strong internal controls.
To make sure everyone is following the rules.
Right, or it could involve running regular risk assessments.
Really digging deep to see where the vulnerabilities are.
Precisely. It's all about being proactive.
Staying one step ahead of the game.
You got it. That's the essence of risk management.
Sounds like a lot of work.
It is. It's an ongoing process.
But it's essential.
Absolutely, because the financial landscape is constantly changing.
So you can never really let your guard down.
You need to have your finger on the pulse at all times.
Speaking of staying on top of things, our sources talk a lot about compliance monitoring.
Ah, yes, monitoring. That's a crucial part of the framework.
So it's not enough to just have systems in place.
No, you need to make sure those systems are actually working.
That they're doing what they're supposed to do.
Right, and that's where monitoring comes in.
So what does compliance monitoring involve?
Well, the FCA expects firms to be actively tracking their compliance performance.
Like keeping a close eye on everything.
Exactly, making sure they're meeting all the requirements.
And spotting any gaps.
Right, any areas where they might be falling short.
So they can take action before it becomes a problem.
Precisely. That's the key.
And one of the tools they use for this is internal audits.
Yes, internal audits are a big part of compliance monitoring.
And those are basically like internal investigations.
Kind of. They're a way to independently assess.
If you're actually following your own procedures.
Exactly, to identify any weaknesses.
And make improvements.
Right, so it's an ongoing cycle of checking and adjusting.
Interesting. So it's not a one-time thing, it's a continuous process.
It is, because compliance is not static.
It's always evolving.
You got.
All right, so we've got the systems in place, we're monitoring everything.
We're on the right track.
But what about the people?
Ah, yes, the human element.
Our sources emphasize the importance of training and competence.
That's essential.
Because you can have the best systems in the world.
But if your people don't understand them,
Or how to follow them.
or why they're important.
Then it's all for nothing.
Exactly, it's all about the people.
So what does the FCA expect in terms of training?
Well, they want to see regular training programs.
To keep staff up to date.
Right, not just on the regulations themselves,
Because those are always changing.
but also on the firm's specific internal compliance procedures.
So everyone knows how things work at their company.
Exactly, so it's tailored to their specific role.
That makes sense.
It does, because compliance is not a one-size-fits-all thing.
It needs to be relevant to what people are actually doing.
You got it.
Okay, so we've got the leadership, the systems, the training.
We're building a solid foundation.
But there's one more piece I want to talk about.
Okay, what's that?
It might seem obvious, but it's something that our sources really emphasize.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
It's the importance of customer outcomes.
Ah, yes. Putting the customer first.
It's not just about ticking boxes and avoiding penalties.
Right. It's about actually delivering good outcomes for your customers.
It's about doing the right thing.
Absolutely. And that's a fundamental shift in the way the FCA approaches regulation.
And they really mean it.
They do. They've introduced this thing called the consumer duty.
Which took full effect in 2023.
Right. And it really pushes this idea of putting the customer front and center.
So it's not enough to just follow the rules?
No, you need to show that you're actually acting in the best interests of your customers.
That you're treating them fairly.
Precisely. And that might mean going above and beyond what the rules strictly require.
So it's about more than just compliance.
It is. It's about building trust.
And creating a positive customer experience.
Exactly, because in the end, that's what matters most.
Happy customers, happy regulators, everyone wins.
Sounds like a good plan.
It does. But how do we know it actually works in the real world?
That's a good question.
Because all of this sounds great in theory.
It does.
But how does it play out in practice?
Right. How do firms actually make this happen?
Well, luckily, our sources have provided us with some real-world examples.
They have.
They've included some case studies that we can dive into.
Perfect. I love a good case study.
Me too. It's a way to see how these principles work in action.
So let's take a look.
Okay, our first case study involves a large UK bank.
A big player.
And they were grappling with GDPR compliance.
Yes, the GDPR, that was a big one for everyone.
It was. It introduced some pretty strict rules about how companies can handle personal data.
And a lot of companies were caught off guard.
This bank included.
It seems like they had some outdated data management practices.
Which put them at risk.
Big time.
So what did they do?
Well, according to our sources, they took a pretty comprehensive approach.
They knew they had to get this right
Yeah, they did. They started with a thorough risk assessment.
to figure out where their data protection gaps were.
Exactly. They needed to know what they were dealing with
And then they brought in key stakeholders from across the bank.
to get everyone on board.
Collaboration is key.
It is, because data protection is not just an IT issue.
It affects the whole organization.
Exactly. So they needed buy-in from everyone
And finally, they invested in new technologies.
to improve their data handling and monitoring.
So they put their money where their mouth was.
They did. They knew they needed to upgrade their systems.
And it seems like it worked.
It did. They saw some really positive results,
They improved their data protection standards,
which was the whole point.
but they also gained customer trust.
Right, because customers care about their data.
And they want to know that it's being handled responsibly.
Absolutely. So that was a big win for the bank,
And they also significantly reduced their risk of fines.
which is always a good thing.
So it was a win-win situation.
It really was. They achieved compliance and they reaped the benefits.
It shows that compliance can be good for business.
Absolutely. It's not just a cost, it's an investment.
Okay, let's move on to our next case study.
All right, what have we got?
This one focuses on an investment firm,
Interesting.
and they were looking to enhance their anti-money laundering controls.
Ah, yes. AML. That's a big one in the financial world.
It is. It's all about preventing criminals from using financial systems to launder money.
It's a constant battle.
It is. And this firm had identified some weaknesses
Weaknesses in what area?
in how they were verifying their clients.
Ah, that's a crucial part of AML compliance.
It is. You need to know who you're dealing with,
Absolutely. And it seems like they weren't doing a thorough enough job.
which raised some red flags.
Understandable.
So they decided to take action.
Good for them.
They implemented a multifaceted strategy.
Multifaceted, so they hit it from all angles
They did. They started by updating their AML policies,
to make sure they were in line with the latest regulations.
which are always changing, as we've discussed.
Right, so you need to stay on top of those.
And then they focused on employee training.
Ah, yes, the human element again.
It's crucial.
It is, because even the best policies are useless if your people don't know how to follow them.
So they made sure everyone was up to speed on best practices and due diligence.
Excellent. So they covered the knowledge gap.
And then finally, they implemented some sophisticated systems
To do what?
to flag any unusual transactions.
Ah, so they brought in some technology to help them?
They did.
Yeah.
Because it's impossible to monitor everything manually.
Right, you need systems to help you spot the red flags.
Exactly. And these systems were specifically designed to detect patterns that could indicate money laundering.
Very smart. So they covered all their bases.
They did. They addressed both the human and technological aspects of AML compliance.
That's a comprehensive approach.
And it seems like it paid off.
It did. They saw some impressive results.
They achieved better compliance rates.
Which is the goal, of course.
They reduced their risk of fraudulent activities.
Which protects them and their customers.
And they got a nice boost to their reputation.
Which is invaluable in the financial world.
So another win-win situation.
It seems like it.
They took the initiative, invested in compliance, and reaped the rewards.
It's a good lesson for all of us.
Okay, ready for our final case study.
Bring it on.
This one is a bit different.
Okay, how so?
It involves a fintech startup,
A startup. Interesting.
and they were facing the challenge of building a robust compliance framework.
From scratch.
Yes, from the ground up.
That's a daunting task.
It is, especially for a startup.
Because they have so much else to worry about.
Right, they're trying to build a business, innovate, disrupt the market.
And on top of all that, they have to navigate this complex regulatory landscape.
It's a lot to handle.
It is, and it's easy to see why some startups might try to cut corners.
But this particular startup was smart.
They took compliance seriously from the outset.
They did. They knew it was essential for building a sustainable business.
And for gaining the trust of investors and customers.
Absolutely. So they approached it strategically.
Tell me more.
They started by developing a detailed compliance roadmap.
A roadmap, that's a good idea.
It outlined all the regulatory requirements they needed to meet.
So they knew what they were aiming for.
Exactly. They had a clear target.
And then they made a savvy move.
How was that?
They invested in RegTech solutions.
RegTech. What's that?
Regulatory technology.
Ah, so they use technology to help them streamline their compliance processes.
Exactly, because compliance can be very manual and time-consuming.
And startups don't have a lot of time or resources.
Right, so they need to be efficient.
And RegTech can help them do that.
Absolutely. It's a game changer for compliance.
And of course, they also established training programs for their employees.
That's a given.
You can't forget about the human element,
No, you can have the best technology in the world, but if your people don't know how to use
or
it,
why it's important.
it's pointless.
So they made sure their team was well-trained.
Oh, smart move.
And it seems like all their efforts paid off.
They did. They achieved their goal,
They launched successfully.
which is a big accomplishment for any startup.
They achieved full compliance.
So they met all the regulatory requirements,
And they earned the trust of their clients.
which is essential for long-term success.
So another great example of how compliance can be a competitive advantage.
Absolutely. This startup understood that compliance was not a hurdle.
But a key part of building a trustworthy and reputable business.
And it seems like that approach is paying off for them.
It is. They're on the right track.
So what can we learn from all of these case studies?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to FCA compliance.
That's true. Every firm is different.
They have different business models, different risk profiles, different resources.
So what works for one firm might not work for another.
Exactly. So it's important to figure out your own strategy
And to be adaptable.
because the financial services industry is constantly changing.
And the regulations are always evolving.
So you need to be prepared to adjust your approach as needed.
You do. It's a dynamic landscape.
But no matter what your strategy is.
There are some fundamental principles that always apply.
Like what?
Well, you need to understand the regulations.
Thoroughly.
Yes, you can't just skim the surface.
You need to know how they apply to your business.
Exactly, and you need to be committed to continuous improvement.
Because compliance is not a one-time thing.
It's an ongoing process.
And you need to be ready to adapt as the industry changes.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
All right, I think we've covered the basics of the FCA compliance framework.
We've laid the groundwork.
But now things are about to get really interesting.
No!
Because we're going to zoom in on a critical element that's becoming more important than ever.
And what's that?
Cybersecurity.
Ah, yes, the elephant in the room.
We can't ignore it any longer.
No, we can't. It's too important.
So let's dive in.
So cybersecurity.
It's a big one.
Mm.
And it seems like every day there's a new story about some company getting hacked or some data breach.
It's definitely a hot topic, and for good reason.
And it's not just a tech issue anymore, is it?
No, it's a business issue, a compliance issue. It affects everyone.
So where does the FCA fit into all of this? What's their stance on cybersecurity?
Well, the FCA recognizes that financial services firms,
They hold a lot of sensitive data.
they do. They're a prime target for cybercriminals.
So the FCA has really stepped up their game when it comes to cybersecurity regulations.
They have. They've made it a key part of their framework.
So what does that look like in practice? What are they expecting from firms?
Well, first and foremost, they expect firms to have robust measures in place to protect customer data.
That's the top priority.
It is. You need to keep that data safe.
And it's not just about having strong passwords and firewalls anymore, is it?
No, it's much more than that.
Our sources mention things like encryption, access management, incident response plans.
This is multi-layer.
You need to have all your bases covered.
Exactly. You need to think about cybersecurity from all angles.
And we've talked about GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation.
Right, that's a big one for data protection.
But there are also specific FCA rules and guidance on cybersecurity, aren't there?
There are. The FCA has been very clear about their expectations.
So it's not just about complying with GDPR.
No, you need to go above and beyond.
And meet the FCA's specific requirements.
Exactly. They have their own set of rules and guidelines.
And those rules cover a lot of ground,
They do. They address everything from technical controls
like encryption and access management.
to policies and procedures for handling cyber incidents and data breaches.
So you need to have a plan in place for when things go wrong.
Because, let's face it, things will go wrong at some point.
It's not a matter of if, but when.
Exactly. So you need to be prepared.
And what happens if you're not prepared? What are the consequences of a cybersecurity breach?
Well, the stakes are high.
I imagine they are,
You could lose customer trust.
which is hard to regain,
It is. And you could suffer significant financial damage.
not to mention the regulatory penalties.
Right. The FCA can hand out some hefty fines.
So it's a lose-lose situation.
It really is. A cyber attack can cripple a financial institution.
And the FCA is not messing around when it comes to enforcement.
They're not. They've made it very clear that cybersecurity is a top priority.
So what can firms do to strengthen their cybersecurity posture? What practical steps can they take to stay on the right side of the FCA?
Well, the first step is to understand the threat landscape.
knowing what you're up against
Exactly. You need to know what kind of threats are out there.
and how they might target your firm
Right. And then you need to address those vulnerabilities.
proactively.
Absolutely. Don't wait for something to happen.
So that means conducting regular risk assessments
Yes, to identify your weaknesses,
and implementing robust security controls.
like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, anti-malware software.
A whole 9 yards.
And you can't forget about your employees.
The human element again,
They can be your strongest asset.
or your weakest link,
Exactly. So you need to provide ongoing cybersecurity training
to make sure they understand the risks.
and how to protect themselves and the company.
So it's a multi-primed approach.
It is. You need to address cybersecurity from all angles.
One of our sources provides a really helpful checklist for data protection.
Oh, what does it say?
Well, it mentions things like lawful and transparent data processing.
That's the foundation of GDPR.
Right, and purpose limitation.
So you're only collecting data for specific purposes.
And data minimization.
only collecting the data you actually need.
And then, of course, strong encryption and access controls.
To keep that data safe.
So it's about building a secure foundation for data protection.
And then building on that with additional layers of security.
And another source takes a wider view of the cybersecurity threat landscape.
Interesting. What do they say?
Well, they mentioned a whole bunch of regulations.
Like what?
Well, there's PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard.
That's for protecting credit card data?
Right, and GLBA, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act.
That's a U.S. law for protecting financial information.
And SOX, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act.
Another U.S. law focused on corporate governance and financial reporting.
And then there are region-specific rules like PSD2 in the EU.
That's the Payment Services Directive.
And MAS regulations in Singapore.
The Monetary Authority of Singapore.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. It's a regulatory maze out there.
But it highlights the fact that cybersecurity is a global issue.
It is. It affects everyone.
And the regulations are constantly evolving.
They are, as technology advances and the threats become more sophisticated.
So firms need to be adaptable and stay informed.
They do. It's a constant learning process.
But it's not impossible.
No, there are resources out there to help.
Like what?
Well, the FCA provides a lot of guidance on cybersecurity.
So they're not just setting the rules, they're also providing support.
Exactly. They want firms to succeed.
And there are industry organizations and cybersecurity experts who can offer advice and assistance.
It's about tapping into the right resources.
And one of our sources mentions a specific initiative that caught my eye.
What's that?
It's called the Financial Services Sector Cybersecurity Profile.
I've heard of that. It aligns with the NIST cybersecurity framework.
Yes, and it seems to have the blessing of regulators.
It does. It's a step towards creating more consistency in cybersecurity practices.
So it's a good thing.
It is. It gives firms a set of best practices and guidelines they can follow.
And it helps them demonstrate compliance.
Exactly. It's a win-win for everyone.
So it seems like we're making progress.
We are, but there's still a long way to go.
Cybersecurity is an ongoing challenge.
It is. It's a never-ending battle.
But it's a battle worth fighting.
Absolutely, because the stakes are too high to ignore it.
Okay, so we've established that cybersecurity is a critical part of FCA compliance.
It's non-negotiable.
But let's be honest, maintaining compliance, whether it's with cybersecurity or the broader FCA framework, can feel overwhelming.
It can. It's a lot to handle.
So what are some of the biggest challenges firms face? And how can they overcome them?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is that the regulations are constantly evolving.
We've talked about that.
We have, but it's worth repeating.
Because it's a major challenge.
It is. The financial services industry is incredibly dynamic.
So firms need to be adaptable.
They do. They need to have systems in place to track regulatory changes.
And to implement those changes quickly.
Exactly, because the FCA doesn't give you a lot of time to adjust.
So you can never really rest on your laurels.
You can't. You need to be vigilant.
And committed to continuous improvement.
Absolutely. Compliance is a journey, not a destination.
I like that. It's a good way to think about it.
It is, because you're never really done.
There's always something new to learn, something new to adapt to.
Exactly. It's a constant process of evolution.
And our sources also mention resource allocation as a challenge,
Right. That's a big one for a lot of firms.
especially smaller firms.
They don't have the same resources as the big banks.
And so it can be tough to dedicate enough time, budget, and personnel to compliance.
It can. It's a balancing act.
Because compliance can be expensive.
It can, but skimping on it can cost you even more in the long run.
Through fines and reputational damage,
Exactly. So you need to find that sweet spot.
where you're managing costs.
But also ensuring that you have adequate resources for compliance.
So it's about being smart and efficient.
It is, and there are ways to do that.
Like what?
Well, you can leverage technology to automate tasks.
That's where RegTech comes in.
Exactly, and you can outsource some aspects of compliance to specialists.
If you don't have the expertise in-house.
Right, and you can focus on training your employees to take ownership of compliance in their roles.
So it's about empowering everyone to be a part of the solution.
Exactly. Compliance is everyone's responsibility.
But our sources also point to a more subtle challenge.
What's that?
Cultural resistance.
That's a tricky one.
It can be difficult to shift mindsets.
It can because people often see compliance as a burden.
Or just a box-ticking exercise.
Right, and if that's the attitude, it's going to be hard to build a strong compliance culture.
So how do you create a culture where compliance is embraced rather than resented?
Well, it starts at the top.
With leadership.
Exactly. Leadership needs to champion compliance.
And make it clear that it's a priority.
They need to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
And they need to provide the resources and support to empower employees to embrace compliance in their day-to-day activities.
It's about making compliance less about rules.
And more about doing the right thing.
Exactly. When compliance is embedded in the organization's values,
And backed up by actions.
it becomes second nature.
So our sources offer some valuable advice on building a robust compliance framework.
They do. They've been there and done that.
So what are some of the key takeaways? What are the things that firms need to keep in mind?
Well, the first thing is to be proactive.
Don't wait for a problem to happen before taking action.
Exactly. Regularly assess your compliance posture
Identify potential vulnerabilities.
and put measures in place to mitigate those risks.
So it's like preventative health care for your business.
I like that analogy.
Just like you wouldn't wait until you're seriously ill to see a doctor.
You shouldn't wait for a compliance breach to occur before taking action.
And remember, continuous improvement is key.
It is. The compliance landscape is constantly shifting.
So be adaptable and willing to adjust your approach as needed.
This might involve seeking external expertise
Or staying informed about industry best practices.
or adopting new technologies to streamline your compliance processes.
So it's not a one-time fix.
It's an ongoing process of learning and adaptation.
And don't forget about stakeholder engagement.
That's important.
It means communicating effectively with regulators.
But also involving your employees at all levels in compliance initiatives.
Creating a shared sense of responsibility.
Exactly. It takes a village to build a strong compliance culture.
And last but not least,
You need buy-in from the top.
without the support of senior management.
It's going to be an uphill battle to build an effective compliance framework.
So it's about leadership, walking the walk.
Not just talking the talk.
When leaders champion compliance,
And demonstrate their commitment through their actions.
it sends a powerful message to the entire organization.
It does. It sets the tone for everything else.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have. We've explored the core components of the FCA compliance framework.
We've examined real-world case studies,
We've delved into the critical role of cybersecurity.
and we've highlighted the challenges firms face in maintaining compliance.
It's been a comprehensive overview.
It has. And now I want to shift gears a bit.
Okay, where are we going?
I want to bring it back to our listener.
The person listening to this right now.
Exactly, because all of this information is great.
It is. It's important to understand the framework.
But what does it actually mean for someone working in the UK financial sector?
That's the key question. How does this apply to their day-to-day work?
That's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm intrigued.
Me too. Let's take a closer look at how we can translate these principles into action.
Let's do it.
All right, so we've journeyed through the ins and outs of the FCA compliance framework.
Explored real-world examples. Those case studies were pretty fascinating, right?
Absolutely, they really brought it all to life.
And we even took that deep dive into cybersecurity, which is more crucial now than ever.
It's a whole other world.
It is, but it's an essential part of the compliance landscape.
So we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
But now, for the million-dollar question,
Hit you with it.
so what? What does all this mean for you? For our listener who's working in the UK financial sector.
That's where the rubber meets the road.
Right. Because it's one thing to understand the theory.
But it's another thing entirely to put these insights into practice.
And that's what makes this conversation so interesting.
It does.
Because our sources don't offer a one-size-fits-all answer.
And that's to be expected.
Because everyone's role in finance is different.
So true. What might be a top priority for one person?
Might be completely irrelevant for someone else.
Exactly. So it's about figuring out how these principles apply to your specific situation.
And our sources give us a framework for thinking about that.
They do. They provide some really useful guidance.
So for you, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about translating these principles into action?
For me, it's the realization that compliance is everyone's responsibility.
It's not just the compliance team's job.
Right. It's not something you can delegate.
It needs to be woven into the fabric of the entire organization.
Absolutely, from the top down.
Whether you're in sales, marketing, customer service, IT, operations.
Everyone has a role to play.
So you're saying that you're not off the hook just because compliance isn't in your job title.
Exactly.
But what does that look like in practice? What can someone do if they're not a compliance professional?
Well, I think the first step is to understand the regulations that directly impact your work.
So do your research, figure out what applies to you.
Right. If you're handling customer data, you need to understand the GDPR.
If you're involved in financial transactions, there are specific regulations for that
Exactly. So take the time to learn about those rules.
and how they apply to your day-to-day activities.
Because that's where the rubber meets the road.
It's about connecting those big picture rules to what you're actually doing.
Absolutely.
And what else can our listeners do?
Well, don't be afraid to ask questions.
If something doesn't seem right,
Or if you're unsure about a procedure.
speak up.
Exactly. A healthy compliance culture encourages open communication and discussion.
And that goes for professional development too, right?
Absolutely. Stay informed about regulatory changes.
Take advantage of training opportunities.
Talk to your colleagues about compliance issues.
So it's about being proactive, both in terms of following the rules.
And staying ahead of the curve when it comes to your knowledge.
I like.
It's a continuous learning process.
And it strikes me that it's not just about blindly following the rules.
Right.
It's also about understanding the why behind them.
That's such a great point.
Because when you understand the rationale behind the rules
It becomes easier to internalize them
and to apply them in different situations.
and to make good decisions.
So take the time to really understand the principles behind the FCA's approach.
Consumer protection,
Market integrity,
ethical conduct.
these are the guiding principles.
They should inform everything you do.
It's about making compliance more than just a chore
It's about seeing it as a way to do the right thing.
for your organization.
And for your customers.
It's about building trust.
Absolutely.
All right, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a few questions to ponder.
Okay, fire away.
First, what are the specific FCA regulations that are most relevant to your role? Take some time to really dig into those and see how they impact what you do every day.
It's about getting specific, not just focusing on the generalities. Second, how can you contribute to a culture of compliance within your team and your organization? Maybe it's promoting open dialogue, encouraging questions, or championing initiatives that improve compliance practices. What can you do to be a compliance advocate?
It's about being proactive and taking ownership.
It is. It's about making a difference.
And finally, how can you stay ahead of the curve? The financial services industry is constantly evolving, so commit to continuous learning. How can you deepen your understanding of compliance issues?
There are so many resources available, online courses, industry events, books, articles.
It's about being curious and staying engaged.
Absolutely.
So by actively engaging with these questions,
You can take your understanding of FCA compliance from theory to action.
it's not just about protecting your organization
It's about protecting yourself.
and building a more trustworthy financial system for everyone.
It's about making a positive impact.
Well said.
And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have, but it's been an enlightening journey.
I hope our listeners feel more confident and equipped to navigate the world of FCA compliance.
I hope so too. It's an ever-evolving landscape.
But with the right knowledge and mindset.
You can not only survive, but thrive.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning
And keep diving deep.
into the fascinating world of compliance.